Hello, welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Alistair Roth, Executive Director of AII Victoria. So a very warm welcome to members of AIIA, our other distinguished guests, and members of the Diplomatic Corps. Today, we're going to be talking about sanctions with Professor Bruce Jentleson, who's just published a book titled Sanctions, What Everyone Needs to Know, and is joining us from the United States. We'll talk about how effective sanctions are, what we can learn from past sanctions, successes and failures, and some of the case histories that he covers in his book. Bruce is William Preston Few Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science at Duke University. In 2020, he was the Desball Chair at College of Asia and Pacific at ANU in Canberra. Currently, he's a Global Fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's worked on US sanctions policy in the State Department during both the Clinton and Obama administrations, and has actually just done a briefing for the Biden administration. So we are in the hands of an expert. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back, and I'll pass over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Alistair, and it's good to be back with AII Victoria. As Alistair mentioned, I was in Australia in early 2020 with the Desmond Ball Chair at Australian National University, enjoying ourselves in Canberra, taking advantage of the wonderful university, meeting with some people in the government about various issues of not just this, but other foreign policy issues. And in fact, in early March 2020, I was in Melbourne. I'd given a talk at Monash, had lunch with former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, whom I'd worked with a lot over the years. And even that evening in early March 2020, went to see the musical Come From Away, sitting next to people and everything. And then it was really within about 2 weeks that it began to become clear that with COVID, if my wife and I didn't leave soon, we might still be in Australia, which would have its benefits. We really enjoyed our time, but we did have to leave a little bit earlier than we had hoped. And it's been great to engage with my colleagues in AIIA Victoria since then through some of these talks. As Alistair mentioned, sanctions is a subject that I've written a lot on with my scholarly hat on, and I've worked a lot on policy. In the early years of the Obama administration, 2009, 2011, I was senior advisor of the Director of Policy Planning, working on the Iran sanctions and other issues. And back in the early days of the Bill Clinton-Al Gore administration, was working on sanctions that came out of Tiananmen Square in China and other issues. I will say that the book title, the subtitle, at least, what everyone needs to know, is a series that Oxford University Press has that goes by that. And it's really an effort to try to write books that bring scholarly work and policy work together. There's a little bit, I must say, I've been teased a little bit about the arrogance of the title. So the best I can say is it's what we think everybody needs to know, but it's not everything everybody needs to know. We don't make that claim here. So I thought I'd make some general remarks about sanctions. I actually started on this book in late 2019, early 2020, because even before the Russia-Ukraine sanctions, it was really hard to browse the news and not read about sanctions. The United States especially uses them. Some people refer to them as the Swiss Army knife of American foreign policy, used for so many different functions. And different administrations differ less over how much they use sanctions than how, why, and against whom. But the Biden administration, even before the Russia case, was using them extensively. The Trump administration used them, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, and going back, much further. China, interestingly enough, increasingly not only is the target of various sanctions from the US and others, and its criticism of sanctions as Western imperialism notwithstanding, but has increasingly been using sanctions for its own purposes. There's a chapter in the book that looks at the ways that China has used sanctions. In fact, a study by your own Australia Strategic Policy Institute listed 19 cases of sanctions imposed by China against others from 2010 to 2020, half of which were since 2018, and there have been some since then, including those against Australia. As I'll talk about as we go along, China has had little to limited success in terms of achieving its policy goals with these sanctions. Interestingly enough, China also uses this, not just formal sanctions, but social media cued sanctions against companies and organizations that it takes issues with. So it doesn't necessarily promulgate them from Beijing, but the word goes out to the wolf warriors and others. We saw this, for example, in the book. There are a lot of cases about this. In the book, I focus on those against the National Basketball Association. You can see behind me a basketball at Duke University. Basketball is really one of our big sports. Our coach, Mike Krzyzewski, the most winningest coach in the history of college basketball, just retired after 40 some odd years. And in fact, I was thinking on the way over here, one of our players a few years ago was an Australian named Jack White, who played for Duke and then came back, played for Melbourne United, and I think is actually in the NBA now. And he played a very good game of basketball. We thought sometimes he brought some footy into the way he played basketball, and went after rebounds and the like. So the U.S. has used sanctions. China has used them. Russia, the Soviet Union used them a lot. Russia is currently using counter sanctions, particularly on natural gas, against Europe and the West. We'll say more about that as we go along. The United Nations, which only used sanctions 4 times in its first 2 decades, between 1945 and 65, has used sanctions over 40 times since then. The European Union also uses sanctions a lot, and others. Japan and South Korea have used sanctions against each other over issues that relate back to the Japanese occupation and colonialism and the like. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different cases as we go along. A lot will involve the United States and China. And I'll want to say a lot about the current Russia-Ukraine case. I've been doing a lot of work on this and writing. I published 2 op-eds in the Washington Post back in January, February, when we were in the run-up to the sanctions, and wrote an article about a month or 2 ago in Foreign Policy about where sanctions stood now. So I know that's on people's minds, and we'll talk some about that as we go along, and then I'll come back to it as time permits at the end. So one big question with sanctions is assessing success. What do we mean by successful sanctions? And here there are 4 main points that we really want to pay attention to as we think about that. We often think that the side that has superior economic power is going to be successful with the sanctions. But it's been proven that it's not enough to have superior economic power. And if you think about it, it's a bit like what we have assumed too often about superior military power being enough to win a war, and it hasn't proven to be the case, not for the U.S. in Iraq or Afghanistan, at least so far, not for Russia and Ukraine. And part of it is that the target of sanctions also has counter strategies. And so there are 3 main, or really 4 main counter strategies that targets tend to use. One is finding alternative trade partners, other than those cooperating with the sanctions. If we go back to the Cold War, the United States and Western Europe did this for Tito in Yugoslavia, who was hit by sanctions from Stalin over his differences with them. The Soviet Union did it for Cuba when we hit them with sanctions. Russia currently has turned to India and China and others as customers for its oil. Interestingly enough, that may be changing. We've seen some pushbacks and strong statements against Russia coming from both India and China in recent days about the war in Ukraine. Your own counter strategy against China's sanctions in Australia with coal and barley and copper and seafood and timber. According to some statistics that the government released last year, about 3.3 of the 4 billion in lost exports to China were found alternative trade partners for those. So alternative trade partners is one way to assuage the economic impact, not necessarily eliminate it, but reduce it. Second is domestic offsets. One of the first main sets of UN sanctions in the 1960s were against Rhodesia, the country is now that Zimbabwe, when they declared a unilateral declaration of independence, trying to maintain white minority rule at a time in which they didn't have independence yet from Britain. And one of the responses, one of the reasons it took 15 years for that change of government to happen, and it was ultimately not just sanctions but the guerrilla war, was the UN sanctions had an infant industry effect. That it actually allowed Rhodesia through import substitution, to do a lot of domestic offsets that really were one of the factors offsetting the sanctions. Russia has done some of this recently. If you recall, back in when the sanctions first hit, the ruble, dramatically fell in terms of its value to the dollar. And by June, it was propped back up to a 7-year high through various policies of their central bank, capital controls and interest rates. Russia also has used increases in retiree pensions and company bailouts. Um, and, it's a little bit of a euphemism to call arrests and political repression domestic offsets. But in many countries, that's what they're doing. Those that are protesting against the sanctions run into the power of the state, in Russia and elsewhere. A third strategy is sanctions busting. Find ways around them. Example here is North Korea, despite the UN sanctions, has found over $2 billion in cryptocurrency to get around those sanctions. And there are a lot of cases. There are reports now of so-called dark oil being transferred to ships from Russia at sea and a variety of other things. And then the fourth strategy is counter-sanctions, where the target of the sanctions imposes sanctions on the original senders of the sanctions. And here, we're really at a point now where Russia is doing this, particularly to Western Europe, and particularly on natural gas, in terms of cutting the supply, forcing industries to shut down, or at least reduce their production. Real questions about home heating, whether it's going to have to be rationed in the winter. So there's really an offense-defense to sanctions that we sometimes forget and say, oh, those that have the strong economic power are going to prevail. But you've got to think about this in the interaction between the offense and the defense. Secondly, is even if there is substantial economic impact, there's often a gap between that substantial economic impact and getting the country to comply in terms of policy terms. Costs get imposed, and that has some value in terms of feeling like your sanctions are a success. But really, sanctions are intended not just to impose costs, but the costs are supposed to be a means to the ends of getting policy change. And in one case after another, we've seen that high economic costs do not necessarily lead to policy change. The United States has had sanctions against Cuba for over 60 years now. Substantial economic impact, but the regime is still there. North Korea, U.S., the UN, and others for over 30 years. Donald Trump's sanctions against Iran had much more economic impact than Barack Obama's did, but it didn't achieve its policy goals. And I'll say more in a second about why Obama's did achieve some significant policy goals. So there is some success in imposing costs. You're punishing those you believe to be punished. But the goal really is policy change. Right now, the sanctions against Russia are intended to impose costs, and those have significance potentially down the road. But the real goal is to try to be one of the elements bringing an end to the war in Ukraine on terms acceptable to Ukraine, the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. There is no equivalent of unconditional surrender in sanctions. There's not a case where any country, as we say, has said uncle. It's about increasing your leverage when you ultimately get to try to have some negotiations to make the changes you want. A lot of times sanctions are targeted against individuals. In the U.S., there's something called the SDN, the Specially Designated Nationals. It has something like 15,000 individuals and organizations on it now, not just related to Russia. Some are Iran, some are China, some are counterterrorism, some are anti-drug and the like. And here you're trying, in addition to the sanctions on countries, to hit individuals that you think are significant. But this gap between impact and policy compliance is often missed, where all the reports are about the economic impact, but you still haven't really achieved your policy goals. So a degree of success, but not much more than that. Another part of sanctions is also, well, we may not change the policy, we're going to send a message. We're going to deter future behavior. And while there can be some cases in which we see this impact, in anything in international affairs, one has to remember that it's not just the message sent, but the message received. If you say you're trying to deter an adversary from doing something through sanctions, the real issue is whether it has that effect on the adversary. Do they perhaps see it as a sign of weakness that you're doing sanctions and not something more coercive? Or do they see the sanctions have holes for sanctions busting, or you're not getting cooperation for allies? So it's an important aspect of signal sending, but just because we declare that the sanctions have a deterrent impact, that's not enough. You really have to analyze whether it's happening. And then another aspect is really an ethical question that really is raised particularly with democracy and human rights sanctions used for those purposes. I testified last week to a congressional testimony on this, particularly on this notion of intentions versus consequences. As well-intended as human rights and democracy promotion sanctions may be, oftentimes they have consequences in which they hit the people they're trying to help. And I call this in the book what I call backfiring and misfiring. Backfiring is when the effects of the sanctions are counterproductive to the intended target state policy change. There was one study done a few years ago by some scholars of 95 countries between 1981 and 2000, and it showed how the sanction regimes cracked down even more on human rights, including torture and political killings, showing that they weren't going to bend to the outside world, be it the US or the UN or Europe or others. And then sometimes sanctions misfire. They hit the people, not the regime. There have been a number of cases where sanctions worsen life expectancy, infant mortality, child malnutrition, women's health, overall public health, poverty, clean water and sanitation, and refugees and internally displaced persons. We've seen this in a number of cases. We're seeing it right now in Venezuela, where, to be sure, the principal responsibility for the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, in fact, the whole destruction of what had been a strong civil society, lies with Chavez and Maduro. But the sanctions by the US and others have really significantly contributed to the humanitarian suffering. With Afghanistan, there was a real question after the Taliban victory about whether to lift sanctions already in place for humanitarian reasons. The Taliban was still killing and arresting anyone at all deemed an opponent. They were repressing women. They held American prisoners. They still links to international terrorist groups. Yet as last winter set in, the winter of 2021-22, 9 million people were facing starvation. To quote David Miliband, who was a former British foreign minister and now president of the International Rescue Committee, the current humanitarian crisis, he was speaking in January 2022, could kill far more Afghans than the past 20 years of war have. Sometimes there are what are called in the policy world carve-outs, trying to make exceptions. And these help a little bit, but one of the phenomena that happens, and this happened in Afghanistan, it's happened a lot with the Syria sanctions, something I'm really quite familiar with from my own policy work, is what in the private sector is called de-risking, where companies and shippers and insurance companies are afraid of even unintentionally, not setting out to sanctions bust, but even unintentionally violating sanctions, and they're being subject to loss of trade privileges, to fines, to prosecution. And so they de-risk, and they often see too much risk in supplying even NGOs that are trying to help people in a humanitarian way in northern Syria, or in Venezuela, or in Iran, or Cuba. And so there's the ethical question is something we really have to think about. I mean, it's hard not to impose sanctions when you see, for example, in Myanmar, how could the US and other democracies not impose sanctions on the military, after its brutal coup in February 2021? You want brutalizers to pay a price. Internal opponents deserve to know the international community stands with them. Yet the military and its supporters largely insulated themselves from the sanctions. Again, one NGO reported them as a humanitarian and displacement catastrophe. So my point really here is we have to really analyze these aspects. And this leads me into the other point, which is it's really important to do net assessment in two respects for sanctions. One, sometimes there can be degrees of success, on the positive side. You don't always achieve everything you set out to, but you get a degree of success. So let me give you two examples from China. One, the sanctions against South Korea over the deployment of the THAAD anti-missile system. South Korea did not get rid of the THAAD anti-missile system, which was China's objective. They did agree to not install another one without discussions. Of course, they didn't have any intentions at the time of doing that. So China could say it accomplished, a secondary objective and saved some face. But it didn't accomplish its principal objective. So there was a degree of success there. And the US has had that in some cases too, where we haven't gotten the full policy change, but we've gotten a portion of it. It also happened, by the way, with China in Norway back in 2010, when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Lin Xiaobo, the dissident. China imposed sanctions on Norwegian salmon and a variety of other things. Norway still gave the Nobel Peace Prize to Lin Xiaobo. But there was some diplomacy afterwards and communiques about improving relations. So you do have to look for degrees of success. It's not binary, absolute failure or not. On the other hand, part of the issue with sanctions is not just that they may not work, but they actually may be net negative. So this is my point about the backfiring and misfiring. If in fact you've made the situation worse for people you're trying to help in terms of human rights and humanitarian aspects, then you're having a net negative effect. You can also have a net negative effect, kind of get carried away in the book with this, with backfiring, misfiring, what I call crossfiring, where you get into disputes with your allies. The current Russia sanctions with Australia, with New Zealand, with Japan, South Korea, and with Europeans have actually had a lot of allied cooperation. But earlier sanctions that we did against earlier Soviet pipelines in the 60s and 80s were major disputes with the Allies. In the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan imposed sanctions against what was called the Siberian natural gas pipeline, even Margaret Thatcher, who agreed with Reagan on most everything, fought the sanctions as an extraterritorial imposition of American policy on Britain. And Britain had a lot of economic interest in not so much the gas, but supplying the pipe, the steel pipe for that. You also can raise the price for allies who may be frontline border states. This has been happening with Colombia in the Venezuela sanctions. It happened with Jordan in the sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s. And some of this is not just waiting to see the effects, but part of my argument, and again, my consultations with folks in this administration has been, you can do an analysis on the front end of what are the likely effects. In fact, the military sometimes does this, sometimes they don't. And if you're concerned that, if you can see the possibility that the sanctions will be net negative, they'll do more harm than good, it's not enough to just say, well, we're standing up for principle, we're doing the right thing, we got domestic pressure. Again, from my experience in government, a lot of times sanctions are the default option. Well, we're not sure what to do, we don't want to use air power or something, so let's do sanctions. Anybody who's been in policy knows that's like writing a memo that says, I can't tell you what the good things are about my option, but here's what's wrong with all the other options. It's not that you're looking for a perfect option, but if you're turning to sanctions too quickly, you cut off the consideration of other options that may be there that may not be net negative, may not be perfect, but may have a greater chance of success. And the Swiss Army knife notion of sanctions in American policy, I think we have sanctions against over 30 countries now and 15,000 individuals. It's very important to do this net assessment on the front end as well as you go along. Let me say a couple words about what are the keys to success of sanctions. I'll mention 5 factors, and these don't guarantee success, but they do make it more likely in terms of that. And again, what I mean by that is closing that economic impact policy compliance gap. So the first one is multilateral support. Sort of obvious, it helps eliminate alternative trade partners. That's been the rationale or thrust for United Nations sanctions. But it's not the be-all and the end-all in a couple of respects. One is there have often been problems with UN sanctions of enforcement in terms of both will and capacity. The UN has created a number of mechanisms to try to do this. It has groups of experts and monitoring groups. Sometimes they've been infiltrated by countries. I mean, for example, on the North Korea sanctions, which China had cooperated with for a while, then when it stopped cooperating, it was revealed that the Chinese official on the UN group of experts was, basically not there as taking what the UN goals were, but communicating with Beijing every night. And enforcement against sanctions busting. Some countries that you're trying to get comply with UN sanctions don't have the capacity. They don't have the bureaucracy they don't have the expertise to determine whether things are being transshipped through their country or through some of their own. So multilateral support is important, but the answer is not, we've got to do everything through the United Nations. And it's also dependent on some of the other factors I'm going to delineate that, when you're trying to do sanctions for, big objectives like regime change, that's not accomplishable. It's not accomplishable, whether you have UN sanctions or not. And multilateral support doesn't always just involve the UN. The current sanctions against Russia and Ukraine are the most extensive non-Security Council sanctions ever. On the one hand, I think the latest statistic I saw is it represents about 60% of global GDP in terms of states cooperating with the sanctions. Although interesting enough, it represents about 60 or 70% of global population not cooperating. Brazil and South Africa have not cooperated. Israel has not cooperated with the sanctions. The Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, the oil producers, we saw just in the past week, it's not that they're trading with the Russians, but the notion of raising production to try to, reduce Russian earnings. They took a step in the past week, which has really caused major controversy in U.S.-Saudi relations, and also so. But there has been much more extensive cooperation with these sanctions multilaterally than any other sanctions the United States has imposed, including those against Iran, including those against Venezuela, against Cuba, and the like. Also, the private sector has been really fascinating on this. There's a database maintained by the Yale School of Business and Management that you can access online if you're interested. And it's identified over 1,000 companies globally that have been in some form cooperating with the sanctions. Indeed, self-sanctioning to a greater extent than they're necessarily required to by their own government policies. Some of these have pulled out totally. Some of these have suspended operations. Some of them have been doing the equivalent of, kind of greenwashing that we call in the environmental, saying they're doing it and not significantly doing it. And this Yale database actually rates the different companies. But it's fascinating, and it's a real contrast to other sanctions. I'm going to give you two examples. The Swedish retailer H&M and the American semiconductor producer Intel, both of whom are cooperating with the Russia sanctions. Yet at the same time, both of them are going around the sanctions against China over the Uyghurs, right? Their motivations, their economic interests are much more substantial in China. So on the one hand, it says something about whether or not the cooperation of the Russia sanctions would carry over to scenarios that might involve Taiwan down the road. We can come back to that if you like. But my point here more is we've had really quite significant cooperation. Here I think the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit. They really have worked these issues with the allies and with others to get that cooperation. A key to success, not a guarantee. Second factor is what I call proportionality. Sanctions are a limited instrument. Again, too much of the language, and I think the Biden administration made this mistake before. The president, back before the Russians invaded, was calling the sanctions devastating, and Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan were using similar language. As I said before, no country ever says uncle to sanctions. We've never seen an unconditional surrender to economic sanctions in any case ever, including going back in history. A little thing in the book about Athens and Sparta and Napoleon's continental system and the like, as well as a lot more recently. And so the proportionality is that sanctions are most effective for limited objectives, where you want to get limited policy change. So South Korea agreed to at least have some discussions before it deployed a second THAAD system. Norway agreed to, smooth over Chinese hurt feelings, but on a limited way. The United States has achieved some limited policy change. But when you're using sanctions for a really big goal, like regime change, you've got this disproportionality of a limited instrument for a pretty extensive objective. And part of this, too, is the balance of interests. If the interest of the target of the sanctions in resisting are really greater, regime survival or a variety of other things like that, than the interest of the states imposing the sanctions, you have a disproportionality. Their interest in resisting are greater than your interest in getting them to comply. So using sanctions for limited objectives is important. And there's a little bit of an exception to that when you combine it with military strategy. Even before I get into Russia and Ukraine, in Myanmar, notwithstanding what I said before about the humanitarian effects, there have been some really interesting reports coming out about the People's Defense Forces that are under the chain of command of the opposition National Unity Government, making major military gains. The Myanmar military, by some estimates, has lost 18,000 troops in the past year. Might be a little high, but that would be a casualty rate of about 2% a month. The economy is getting squeezed by the sanctions. even though they're still mostly just the U.S. and Europe and the EU, and a whole lot of corruption going on. So the combination of the sanctions with some success for military strategy on the ground can create a bit of a pincer effect. Sanctions on their own really have not ended wars. You could go back to the League of Nations sanctions in the mid-1930s against Benito Mussolini. They did not prevent his invasion of Ethiopia, Abyssinia in 1935-36, nor his use of chemical weapons there, nor his further conquest of them. They did not prevent Saddam Hussein from invading Kuwait in 1990, the threat of sanctions. They did not prevent Putin from invading invading Ukraine in 2022. But when they're combined with military strategy, and we are seeing some of this in the Russia-Ukraine theater, where had the Ukrainian military not been as successful and courageous as it's been, and the support it's been receiving from the West, from the NATO, from the United States, from others, had it not been that successful, we wouldn't be talking about sanctions today. It doesn't matter how severe they were on Russia. Russia would have conquered Ukraine. But because the military strategy has inflicted pain, and here I call your attention particularly not just to the general squeeze on the Russian economy, but to those that have been affecting its military capabilities. There was an estimate that I used in one of the articles I wrote recently that the Russians had lost about 3,000 pieces of heavy equipment artillery in Ukraine. That's where the semiconductor sanctions really have impact. They have been, taking semiconductors out of refrigerators and dishwashers, and they've lost a number of precision-guided missiles. They obviously still have enough missiles to be attacking Ukrainian cities right now. But the combination of that and what we're seeing in Russia with the increasing opposition to this from people that are supposedly being called up in this new draft and a variety of other things. So when you have a major objective like trying to end a war, if sanctions are combined with an effective military strategy, then you may be able to achieve a bit more major objective. And we'll see, the jury's still out on the Russia-Ukraine case and also on the Myanmar case. But that combination, because you're directly affecting the military capability, you're not just squeezing the economy and raising inflation or contributing to unemployment. So multilateral support, proportionality, combining economic coercion and military strategy. And then the other factor two other factors. One is what I call reciprocity. Ultimately, as I said, even in these cases I'm talking about, like Russia and Ukraine, I don't foresee Putin or any other Russian leader saying uncle and saying, I'm just getting out. What you use sanctions for is for diplomacy to increase your leverage. And here the example that really illustrates this are the Iran sanctions of the Obama administration and the Trump administration. The Obama sanctions, which got cooperation from Europe, actually from China and Russia as well, increased the economic pressure on Iran, but was combined with a limited policy objective, nuclear nonproliferation. It wasn't about regime change. And that combination effectively achieved the JCPOA, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Agreement, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which by most accounts, and again, I served in the Obama administration, others may have other views, by most accounts, including Israeli intelligence, was working reasonably well. Trump abandoned it. He went to what he called maximum pressure. He increased the sanctions on Iran even greater than they were before they'd been relaxed with the JCPOA. He had much greater economic impact on Iran than the Obama sanctions had and that the UN sanctions before the Obama ones had. But his goal was regime change. He wasn't about diplomacy and leverage. And there are other cases as well. Not to go into too much detail, I want to start wrapping up, but back in 2003, the U.S. and Britain negotiated an agreement with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya to end his development of weapons of mass destruction programs. He didn't have weapons yet, but he had WMD programs. And to get him to make some concessions on terrorism, including some outstanding cases. In 1989, he was involved in blowing up the Pan Am 103 airliner. It's killed over 200 people. In return for lifting some sanctions. And they used that for diplomacy. I should add that the lead American diplomat then was the then Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, William Burns, now the head of the CIA. So as we look down the road at Russia-Ukraine, we're really talking about questions about diplomacy and leverage, and what would be the inducement, the reciprocity here in this particularly difficult situation that would be uh, enough to get the kind of deal and acceptable to the Ukrainians, acceptable to the United States, acceptable to NATO, acceptable to others in the world. But you have to think about reciprocity, not just saying uncle. Last point is that, ultimately, a lot of times with sanctions, you're really trying to affect the domestic politics inside the target of the sanctions. Not just democracies, but non-democracies. This has been, one of the rationales for the sanctions against Russian oligarchs. Frankly, a lot of the oligarchs being hit are Yeltsin-era oligarchs who aren't part of the Putin inner circles. This is what happened in Libya, for example, where it began to hit those that were not, we're not talking about going for elections, but those that had influence with Gaddafi, both inside government and in the oil sector. And the metaphor I use here is whether these power brokers inside countries act as transmission belts or circuit breakers. If their interests remain the same as resisting the outside pressure, as the regime's interests are, they're circuit breakers. They break the circuit. But if their interests begin to be better served, if some of the policy changes that are being pursued by the sanctioning states happen, they can be transmission belts, taking that inside the country. This happened in Iran in 2015, happened in Libya 2003. It's a really interesting question today in Russia. Let me simply say that, it's not that we should be waiting for some change of leadership or pressure, but it also can't be dismissed. And I think over the last couple of weeks, we've been seeing a lot of pressure from the right wing in Putin, escalate the war, do more. But also a lot of discontent. And you start to wonder, not so much will there be another Gorbachev coming down the road, but whether or not some of the nationalists, it's called in Russia the Siloviki, those in the military and intelligence and military industrial complex, those who never wanted Ukraine to join NATO and may not want Ukraine to join NATO now, but are proud Russians and nationalists, and they see what's happening to their military. They see they're having to get drones from Iran and military aid from North Korea, and whether or not there's pressure in Russia. I think that's an open question. That again, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but sometimes in the policy discourse we simply say that these leaders, they're all powerful and nothing can happen. So. So anyway, those are the factors. The degree of multilateral support, the proportionality of objectives, military strategy, reciprocity, and investment. And if that's your template when you think about imposing sanctions, whether the U.S., UN, China, others, and you lay that on the case at hand, that's not just a magic thing. It really helps you get a sense for what your strategy should be, what that possible net assessment is. And that's the way I think that kind of strategic analysis can come along with dealing with the policy at hand. Last point I think I'll make, and just coming back to the Russia case, I think is this question of where we are now. And we're really in what I think of as an economic war of attrition. The original threat of sanctions to deter the invasion didn't happen. Putin may have not been deterrable given his vision of the greater Russia. But there are a lot of other instances, as I mentioned, where sanctions haven't deterred invasions. The sort of shock and awe, if you will, of compellence, the shock to the Russian economy didn't happen. Again, that target state counter strategies, defense strategies. And the economic war of attrition we're in now is the Russian economy is taking a greater toll. Some of these offsets, even the head of the Russian central bank has said, she's not convinced that they can work as well over time. Will that economic impact increase over time? Not to say open-ended, but over time, over the next few months, let's say, or the Russian counter-sanctions, what toll will they take? Europe has been very defiant so far. The EU has an energy sharing agreement, but it has a lot of loopholes in it. And I think that, again, for Americans, we sometimes, criticize the Europeans for, not, being tough enough on these issues. Our politics, frankly, right now have been tremendously affected by paying $1 more for gasoline. And people that might be facing home heating rationing, that can bring some real pressure. And I think that's what Putin is seeing if he can hold out for. We don't quite know what's going to happen there. And as we head into winter, that's going to be a real question. If the sanctions do succeed, along with the other strategies in ending the war in Ukraine on terms we all consider favorable, this will be seen as a case in which sanctions had some, had some significant success. But I think that the factors that contribute to that may not be generalizable to other cases. This was a, invasion of one country over another. It was in the heart of Europe. The Europeans reacted in a way that they don't react differently. The Russians have, had atrocities and the like. So it remains to be seen, what will happen in this case. But coming back to the original point about the use of sanctions, they're overused, and like any other strategy, we should be more careful about using them in ways in which they have a decent chance of being effective. So I'm going to stop there. Went on a little longer than I wanted, but I'd love to take any questions or comments from folks. Thanks very much.
Sure. Well, Bruce, thank you very much. It's a very complex subject, but you've ranged widely over it. Thank you, and informed us. I mean, I suppose Russia and Ukraine is obviously in the headlights, and perhaps you can't draw necessarily general lessons from that. But just I mean, looking at the sort of the time lag issue, the Economist was making a point fairly recently that if sanctions could be kept in place for a 3 to 5 year time span, that would create some degree of havoc in Russia's economy. They quoted something like, by 2025, a fifth of all civil aircraft would have to be grounded because of lack of spares. But in the interim, especially with energy prices up, they're able to absorb it. So is there a question of whether any evidence of sanctions fatigue in those bringing them to bear, or how long, who blinks first? Is that part of the issue?
It is, with this economic war of attrition, Alistair. And I think, I'll be honest, in some of my discussions with some of my friends and colleagues in the Biden administration, they've been arguing, well, they may not, end the war in Ukraine, but they will hurt Russia for the long term strategically. The goal right now is the war in Ukraine. And the notion of that lasting for 3 to 5 years is beyond thinking about, including escalation, the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Will it escalate horizontally by means to another country, a NATO member, or Moldova, or vertically up that nuclear ladder? And so my focus is fundamentally on its principal objective, which cannot be a factor to try to end the war in Ukraine on favorable terms to Ukraine. And there's disagreement on what those terms would be. David Ignatius, the Washington Post columnist, had a column today about what the Ukrainians were thinking, and I'm not sure that's the same thing that the U.S. and NATO and others around the world are thinking. So that's my. I also think if there is a scenario, next 6 months, year, whatever, in which the war ends and Russia withdraws and the terms are considered acceptable, I don't think that Europe will ever go back to the degree of dependency on Russian natural gas. Part of that was it was cheap. Part of it was getting away from the Middle East, which is unstable. But this notion of decoupling, I think Russian gas will be there, and I think depending upon where we are with a new, if there's a new Russian government diplomacy, there will be economic relations between the West and Russia again. Not, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. So I think the long-term argument doesn't account for the risks of the short term. And if you can achieve the short term and have some longer term effect, great. But you can't trade off the long term for the immediate.
Yeah, I understand. You talked, Bruce, about the Swiss Army knife of other options to use instead of or combine with sanctions. What are the most effective other tools on that Swiss Army knife that could be used? I mean, other than, for example, hard military power.
Yeah, I'll give you an example on human rights that relates to Cuba. So a few years ago, the United States position, and we changes a bit during the Obama years. We started to normalize relations. I got to go to Cuba, which was absolutely fascinating. Um, and um, but the United States has basically been all or nothing, right? Regime change, total change. The Europeans, particularly the Spaniards, who had this old colonial relationship with Spain, a few years back, negotiating through the Catholic Church, they were able to free about, I think it was number was 62. Don't quote me the exact number. It was over 50 Cuban dissidents by having a limited lifting of sanctions. Um, and that wasn't everything, but it was much more than the United States has achieved in 60 plus years, right? And I think on the human rights issues, it's just extremely important that we take into account this backfiring and misfiring. And there are other things you can do. There are information campaigns. There's things you can do covertly, not overthrowing governments, but trying to aid resistance movements and the like. There are a variety of things you can do that are there that aren't just military force. We've tried, the UN really tried to do, in the 90s, there were these comprehensive sanctions, and in places like Haiti, it, furthered driving the people into poverty. And so they developed targeted sanctions. Hit the elites, targeted sanctions haven't stayed that targeted, but you still can try to make them more targeted and hit the elites. But you really have to have a good strategy all the way through to make that happen. So, there are a lot of different things that can be done, but in any discussion, we say, well, when in doubt, reach for sanctions. It short circuits, good policy analysis.
Just a side question on UN sanctions. Is that something that needs endorsement by the Security Council and could be vetoed? Or
yeah, that's why there are no sanctions against Russia now.
Yeah.
And a lot of the cases have been in Africa,
Mm.
Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and there they've had different, they extend over time, and at different times they've had different sets of sanctions. One of the issues there that I didn't mention, it affects UN sanctions, but also US sanctions, is this, what are the criteria for lifting? This may fit rugby and footy too, but we talk about moving the goalposts, right? And, that's what happens, a lot of states say. I mean, Iran was saying that during the Trump years. Well, you say we're going to do this, and then if we do that, you're going to ask for more. And so there really has to be a situation where you've made clear, and it's like a lot of diplomacy, it's tricky. You don't want to give too much for too little, but you don't want to give too little for too much. And in the American system, when we have sanctions that Congress legislates, the president has limited discretion. Sometimes they build in some discretion to lift those. For example, now Congress has wanted to put Russia on the state list of state supporters of terrorism. And the Biden administration has resisted. Because then, if it wants to ultimately negotiate, there are certain sanctions it doesn't have the authority to lift. So when they've done by executive agreement or an executive order in our system, yours is different, parliamentary systems are different. That's preferable, I think, from a strategy point of view.
Yeah, that's a very interesting distinction, actually. I mean, I was interested. You mentioned the SDN, the list of those individuals, 15,000 odd. I mean, on the Russia case again, the imposition of sanctions on the oligarchs or seizing super yachts, whatever. Do you think that is an effective angle to still pursue?
Very limited. I really do. I think that, again, a lot of these ones that have been hit, the owner of the Chelsea football team and others, Abramowitz, were like Yeltsin era. Some sanctions were directed at Putin and people in his inner circle. Russia had over $600 billion in hard currency reserves, and we, including the Swiss, by the way, Swiss actually cooperated with this, which they really do for sanctions. Froze about 300 billion of that. But a lot of times, including the UN, they'll sanction leaders and stuff. And, it sounds like and it may give you a certain satisfaction or political benefit. I'm hitting the bad guy. But it's not necessarily going to change policy. I sometimes say people, if their families go shop and can't go to London and shop in Harrods, it's not necessarily going to get them to change their policy. So, some of it is message sending and signaling, but I'm trying to think about what really works.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question on arms embargoes, which I suppose are different type of sanction. But do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, those can be effective because again, there the goal is to prevent the particular commodity equipment from reaching the target, which is different than trying to prevent something to get the target to change policy. You're trying to limit capabilities directly. The problem with a lot of arms embargoes has been enforcement, black markets. Again, a lot of this has been in African conflicts, where a lot of it is small weaponry, small arms, and the like. Um, but that can be effective. But sometimes back in the Serbia case in the 90s, there's a sense it hurt the opposition too, right? It hurt the Bosnian Muslims that you're trying to help. So you've really got to tailor it, and the like. I think, that's where I was emphasizing things like the semiconductors really genuinely affecting Russian military capability, not just the general squeeze on the economy.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. The fact they're having to cannibalize washing machines and dishwashers, but on the semiconductors particularly, how good do you think the intelligence is on whether China, for example, is evading sanctions against Russia on the semiconductors?
China's been fascinating in this, right? We had the Olympics partnership with no limits, and most of what I've seen, again, I don't have access to classified things anymore. Um, um, and Most of the reports have been that so China's been buying a lot of Russian oil and natural gas at discounted prices. You know, India the same. India went from 2% of its oil coming from Russia to 20%, and a lot of it then refines and uses, and it refines and sells to other markets. Um, China has been joining Russia in the rhetoric. This is Western imperialism, American hegemony, but it's been very limited, including things that are direct military capacity in aiding Russia. And some of that is concern about secondary sanctions that could affect companies operating in China. But I actually think it's more of a strategic calculation. I think that Putin has demonstrated himself to be not a partner you really want to have. And so when at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit a couple of weeks ago, Prime Minister Modi, and India has a very close relationship with Russia. I mean, Americans, sometimes don't understand that, many countries in the world want to have relations with many different powers. I think Australia does as well. You're trying to work on your relationship with China in your new government, with Foreign Minister Wang and your Prime Minister, at the same time participating in the Quad. But when Prime Minister Modi, publicly criticized Putin, and Xi apparently sent the message privately, President Xi Jinping, Putin repeated. And then this past week, they both were outspoken. And so I think China has a sense of its interests, which aren't to totally support the Americans by any stretch of the imagination, but I think have been giving less support to Russia than a lot of people thought they would.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're getting sort of close to wrapping up the subject, Bruce, but I just wanted to start to bring it to a close. Is there any example you have where sanctions really have worked well and succeeded?
Yeah, I think one of the iconic examples is South Africa anti-apartheid.
Mm.
And it took a lot of years, your earlier point, Alistair. I think the first UN sanctions were an arms embargo in the early 60s. Um, and it's an interesting story, right? The U.S. was late to join those. It's really the mid-1980s when we did. And for those who are interested in American politics, the Anti-Apartheid Sanctions Act passed by Congress in 1986 was passed by a Republican Senate, vetoed by President Reagan. And in our system, you need a two-thirds majority in both the Senate and the House to override. That was overridden. It's an interesting commentary on where our politics are today. And at the same time, banks began to not roll over loans, not because of the apartheid issue, but because it was a bad investment. And the other piece, and this is actually part of the Russia sanctions, interesting, where the banning South Africa from World Rugby and World Cricket, and you all know how important that is to them. They're your sports more than ours, drove the sanctions home to the average Afrikaner. So some of the sanctions against Russia, on the World Cup, the International Weightlifting Association, a big sport in Russia, banned them. Some cultural ones in Europe have been directed at that. At the same time, it was not so much international diplomacy, but internal diplomacy. It wasn't that the ANC went to the street. It was the ability of Prime Minister de Klerk, and the iconic Nelson Mandela to negotiate agreement. And what was that agreement? It wasn't the Afrikaner saying uncle. It was for majority rule with minority rights and stuff. So that's the iconic case. And you think of all the things that went into that. And there was some American sanctions against Latin American military governments in the late 70s. Actually, Jimmy Carter did a lot of that. Had some impact because they were so dependent upon us for their military aid, and began to really change their policies, and ultimately by the early 80s led to big policy changes. So those are a couple examples that are worth thinking about.
We've got one question that's jumped in to finish us off, but just this is very, very hypothetical, looking at Taiwan and if China was to move on Taiwan. Do you see sanctions being a tool to bring that to a objective that would be effective?
Yeah, it's a really good one to end on. There's been a lot of speculation on that. There are people that saying, again, even to the extent that they have had some impact, and that's where I think the Ukraine case, Russia-Ukraine case, is very unique. Whatever else we think about Taiwan, if China were to try to seize Taiwan by force, that would be still more of an intrastate issue, not interstate, right? Number one. Number two, China's probably learned a lot from the brutality. And number three, the companies I mentioned. You would not get the same cooperation from the private sector. And I was struck when our Speaker of the House, Pelosi, went to Taiwan a couple of months ago, and the new president of South Korea, conservative president, refused to meet with her. I know, and again, I know from discussions with colleagues in Australia that, there's concerns about Taiwan, but people are a little worried about American policy too. So whether you get this same international support, I think is very, very questionable. So they would be imposed, but I think that the impact would be, my guesses would be a lot less than they are in the Russia-Ukraine case.
Well, it's an issue that we hope stays hypothetical. But okay, well that brings us really to our time. So Bruce, thank you very much for joining us from the US. Thank you to the audience for interesting questions, and we'll send out a link to the book when we send the recording out. So Bruce, all the best. Thank you so much. It was good to see you again, and we will doubtless be in touch.
Great. Thank you very much, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience.